Most of us are quite familiar with one of the stories that is at the front of our Bibles. And that's the story of Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden. And the story goes something like this. They were given everything, even the power to name everything. And then they got kind of greedy. And the theologians, the Christian theologians, say they decided that they wanted to be like God. So the sin of pride got in their way. And because of that, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden forever. That's the way St. Augustine tells the story in the 4th century. And that became the core theology of how to understand sin from the 4th century to the present time. However, it's very interesting when you look at Jewish commentaries and you hear Jews today talk about the same story. And why the early church never consulted with the rabbis before coming up with their own version, I don't know. But the Jews tell the story sort of like this. God was growing tired of Adam and Eve acting like children, not taking responsibility, and said, Adam, Eve, everything here belongs to you, except that tree over there. Don't touch that tree. Now, I'm going to run down to the store for 5 minutes, and then I'll be back. Remember, don't touch that tree. So God comes back, they're hiding, and God says, where are you? And they said, well, we're naked. Who told you you were naked? And he thought, okay, your childhood has just ended. Now you get to be grown-ups in the world. And so they were cast out of the land of being children and irresponsible forever, and had to grow up and be in the world. That's the way the Jewish community tells the story. And they say that the sin was not pride trying to be like God. The sin was, if you could even call it that, shame. Because they didn't embrace their own humanness. They were embarrassed by their own humanness. And God said, why are you hiding? And they said, we're naked. Who told you you were naked? In other words, why be ashamed? Shame has been a part of each of our lives in some way. We all know it. And we can trace back to certain stories, probably. I think of one that, besides my mother getting embarrassed by me like I mentioned earlier, I remember one that was really devastating, and most of us have something like this. I remember a counselor, a high school counselor, sitting down with me my sophomore year in high school and saying, Sid, what are your plans after high school? And I said, I plan to go to college. And these were his exact words. You are not college material. You need to think about something else. That was devastating. I went home and told my mother what he said, and unbeknownst to me 2 years later, she went to his office the next day and gave him something. That was embarrassing. And most of us have things like that, where we were told something, we were scolded in some way that we didn't deserve. We were pulled out in a way that made everybody watch us. Something has grabbed each of us and reminded us that we all feel shame. And shame is different than guilt. Guilt is more like, you do something, you've harmed somebody, you've said something mean, and there's an appropriate kind of guilt that comes with that. There's an appropriate way of saying, I messed up, and I shouldn't do that again. Shame is more persistent. It's often not even attached to a particular thing. It's instead of the feeling like I did something wrong, like you have with guilt, shame has more of the feeling of I am wrong. There's something about me that's wrong, that's bad. That's why shame can be so toxic and destructive. It can tear people apart. It can tear families apart, tear communities apart. And as children, we become pretty effective at distancing ourselves from shame. We have deflective sort of instincts that help us survive, especially if we've had a lot of shame come from our family of origin or our school. There are ways that we learn as children to survive and cope, to deflect that shame. If you've been if you feel like you are not enough, sometimes the person that feels like that becomes an overachiever as an adult. They overdo everything, and they want everybody to know how accomplished they are, because inside they don't really feel accomplished, right? Sometimes when their adults feel shame, they've learned to just deflect by disappearing, by not engaging. Why bother engaging if you don't feel like you're worthwhile? Sometimes people deflect their shame by becoming holier than thou. We've known those people, right? The ones that are super righteous, super religious, but maybe inside they're feeling like they're really letting God down all the time. We all have ways of deflecting shame. And some of that can be healthy. That's a way to survive. It's a way to make it through our families. And probably the most toxic kind of manifestation of shame in our world are those people that are so narcissistic that everything they say and do is always about somebody else. And that can be our neighbor next door. It can be a leader in the world. Those things are all part of that toxic shame that tends to encompass us. And that is the backdrop for Jesus' encounter with this woman caught in adultery. It's one of the most powerful stories in the New Testament because this woman is exposed publicly in a way that is absolutely humiliating. And not only that, but the scribes and Pharisees are not only humiliating her, but because of her adultery that she's caught in, but they're also wanting to make an example of her and trick Jesus into saying something that they want him to say. So she gets sort of a double whammy. Not only the shame from her adultery, but being used as a tool by them to trick Jesus. And so we see in this passage this woman who's just been beat up emotionally. We don't know her backstory, but there are some things that we do know from church history. One of those is this. Adultery in those days wasn't typically someone who's having an affair while they're married. That did happen on occasion. But there are a couple of important things to know. Number one, only women were accused of adultery, not men. Isn't that curious? So men could do sort of whatever they wanted and sort of get a back slap, whatever. But women were publicly shamed. And stoning was one of the ways that they shamed them. Secondly, only men could divorce in those days. Women could not divorce. They did not have the legal right to divorce. So if a woman caught her husband in some sort of act of adultery, she had no recourse. That's just what men do, right? But a man could dismiss her without even going to a judge. Men could divorce for any circumstance. If they didn't like you anymore, they could divorce. And women at that time were not allowed to be employed. They had to be dependent on their husband for their income. And so it was typical for a woman to be about 13 years old and a marriage arranged to a man that was twice her age. That's why we never hear about Joseph, Mary's husband, in later years. He was probably twice her age. She was a child when she was married to him, and he's probably deceased by the time Jesus is arrested. And Mary's only 13 or 14 years older than her oldest son. Women had no recourse. So what could a woman who was divorced do to survive? There were two main things. One was to beg, to be a beggar on the side of the road and hope that people would have mercy on them. The other was prostitution. This woman, Jesus understood, was the victim of a system that was unjust, a system that wasn't fair, that put her at the lowest place. And these scribes and Pharisees, only males, by the way, who had all the privilege in that society, were trying to punish her. Now, had she committed adultery? Had she been a prostitute? We don't know. But we know that if she was, the likely circumstances were around her being in a system that was unfair and unjust. And Jesus knew that. He also knew that the Pharisees and Scribes knew that as well. One of the things about Scribes and Pharisees is their whole point. There were two main groups in those days of they were lay people, they weren't ordained, they were leaders in society. There were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Sadducees were the Zadokites. That's the Hebrew word for the Zadokite. And they were priests. They were keepers of the law. The Pharisees, which is a word that means to separate from the law, separate from the Pharisees, or from the Zadokites, from the Sadducees. They saw that the Pharisees were about looking at the intention behind the law, not just the law. So these Pharisees were smart people. They were used to looking at not just the law, but what's behind the law. What's the motivation of people? And so they knew the circumstances of this woman, and yet they were willing to publicly shame her. And Jesus does this really odd thing. He reaches down and writes something in the dust. It doesn't ever say what he wrote down. We don't know what he wrote. He may have just did chicken scratch, just whatever. But they would have recognized his action as hearkening back to the passage we heard from Jeremiah, where they were writing in the dust together. In other words, when you bend down to write in the dust, it's a way of saying, we are all dust. We are all earthbound. We are all at the same level. There is no Pharisee up here and a woman caught in adultery here. In the dust, the place we all must end up, we're equal. In other words, God is in this woman as fully as she's in you, Mr. Pharisee. A powerful passage. Jesus wanted to turn their shame that they projected on the woman back onto themselves. I wonder what John, the writer of the gospel, was intending when he told the story. It doesn't appear in any of the other gospels. It's the only place that this story shows up. And yet it is so powerful. Would the hearers in the first century have identified with the woman? Would they have identified with the Pharisees? Or would they have identified with Jesus? My guess is, like most of us, when we read that story, we identify with the woman. We can identify times that we felt shame and embarrassed. But I think the gospel writer, John, wanted the hearers to identify with the Pharisees and to recognize that they were the ones that the early church was often being judgmental and shaming in ways that were inappropriate. And then after they felt that, to then identify with Jesus, who rode in the dust and said, we're all on the same page, people. I love the quote that I put in the bulletin this week from Anne Lamott. I think Jesus understood this. You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. Right? Right? And so, the gospel writer, by telling the story, was pointing that we do that, pointing out that we do that, and saying, this needs to shift. Now, a couple of years ago, there was this thing floating around that empathy is a bad thing. You remember that? I was like, really? This is a thing? The people were saying that it's weak to be empathetic. It shows that you're soft. Folks, I don't know where that came from, because that is not true. To be empathetic means to be mature and to be responsible and to be humble. To be able to look down into that dust and know that this is where we all come from and where we return. Shame continues to be toxic in our world, in our families, and sometimes even the church. Sometimes the church is the worst of all in shaming. But if we're taking this story seriously, where Jesus looks at the woman and says, where did they go? They'd all disappeared. And he says, you go now too. And your sins are forgiven. There is a power in empathy that is healing and transformative. And it is the way we slay shame. Amen.